Sometimes the easiest thing to do for a survivor is to blame themselves, because then, well, if I don't do this again, if I don't go to this place again, it won't happen. But again, we know that that's not the reason why sexual assault happens. It's because someone else has chosen to do that.
How would you define sexual assault to begin with?
Consent is dynamic. It can change at any time. If there is a sexual act where there was no consent, or a party is not able to give consent, then that creates these conditions during which sexual assault or sexual violence can arise. It could be subtle, it can be direct, but most importantly, it has to be a conversation and agreement between the parties.
How would you say sexual assault differs from physical violence, especially within relationships?
In a relationship, there's a level of intimacy and trust.
Okay.
And so when physical violence occurs or sexual violence or sexual assault occurs, there's that just ultimate betrayal. Of course, the difference is that sexual assault involves sexual activity or sexual acts that are, again, without the consent of that person.
When that happens and they come in for treatment, how does that help them?
The first goal we have is we want to make sure that we're providing them a safe space. And that can include inviting them in for an in-person appointment. One option might be doing a group that we have that I actually facilitate called RISE, which is a support group for survivors. So what we emphasize is wherever your healing is at, like that's normal. Healing does happen naturally.
Right.
And it happens with being present with yourself, getting back to your routine, engaging in self-care.
Each treatment is unique.
Each treatment decision or the plan of what to pursue next is really individualized, because what's happened to them has robbed them of that sense of advocacy. And so we really want to create this opposite experience for them, where they get to choose what their healing is going to look like. They have agency, they have control.
Why do we call them survivors and not victims?
I regularly use the word survivor when I'm working with survivors, is that we want to emphasize that the choice of their healing is on them moving forward. When we get into talking about victims, I think often the mentality becomes something happened to them, and often the focus becomes about that thing that happened.
That goes back to that agency, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Absolutely.
What are some common things survivors might experience after the fact?
From trauma research, and actually particularly for sexual trauma or sexual assault, is that there's a universal set of reactions that happen for survivors after an act of sexual violence. Re-experiencing the traumatic event through nightmares or distressing images that come up, oscillations between sadness, fear, anger at the self, anger at the perpetrator, anger at the world. At state, we see difficulty with concentration, focus, sleep, eating, attending classes. And then the other kind of big experience we see is avoidance, people not wanting to talk about what's happening, people just pretending it didn't happen.
So that's on point with one of the questions that I have here.
Yeah.
When people don't seek treatment right away, do they experience adverse effects?
Prior to coming here, I used to work at the VA hospital with veterans who had experienced what we call military sexual trauma.
Right.
So oftentimes I saw those folks decades after that event happened. And so they have survived that time because they did what they needed to do, which often includes avoiding and not talking about it. And that's when you start to see the anger, the emotion, other emotions, the nightmares, these other reactions that we talked about. Yeah.
So those would be like triggering events.
Potentially, yeah. And it can feel like, where did this come from? And because avoidance, if you've been avoiding so long, you forget maybe what that relation of that triggering event could be to what you've experienced in the past.
Could you tell us about those entities you work with?
Absolutely. So the great thing about SDSU is that there are several points of contact for survivors depending on where they're at in their healing. So for example, if a survivor is seeking university accommodations, and that can include an investigation that involves another member of the SDSU community, we've got Title IX resources on campus. If a survivor is looking to pursue a criminal case, we've got the SDSU police. For physical concerns related to the impact of the sexual assault, which can include getting STD testing, pregnancy testing, we've got student health services. And then for survivors, as I mentioned, the act of sexual assault and really sexual violence acts in general, they're so disorienting sometimes it's not so clear what the next step is going to be. And so
Mhm.
for those survivors, or for survivors who just want confidential resources, we've got the Sexual Violence Victim Advocate, and then Counseling and Psychological Services is the other confidential resource.